What's up, YouTube? We got a really cool production recreation today. We're going to be talking Genesis, Phil Collins vocal effects, crazy keyboard sounds, and all sorts of really fun stuff. So, if you're new to my channel, basically what I like to do is I like to take a classic record. I try my best to recreate it totally from scratch, right here in my own studio. And then afterwards, we go through, we talk about how I did it and what I learned along the way. So, the song we're looking at today is called Land of Confusion, off of their album Invisible Touch, and I think it's a really great example of the Genesis sound and their approach to producing a song. So I think it's gonna be a lot of really cool stuff to go over. Genesis is one of my all-time favorite bands, and I'm excited to go through it with you guys. So let's go ahead and just give it a listen from top to bottom, and then we will dive in. So here we go. Okay, cool. So a lot of really cool stuff happening in this track. And so let's just get a couple of the plugs out of the way real quick. If you like what I'm doing, if you enjoy this content, down in the description down below, there's a link to PayPal where you can support me. Send me a buck, if you like what I'm doing. And that really goes a long way to helping me keep doing this. And then another thing, which I'm very excited to announce, is my very first course. So you may have already seen this, but I launched my very first course called Iconic Mixing and Mastering, and it is a full walkthrough of my entire process to mix and master a record. exactly how I do it on this channel. So if you've been enjoying some of the things you've been hearing on this channel, that's going to be a really great kind of deep dive into start to finish my entire workflow. It's basically everything that I know about mixing and mastering in a course. Anyway, so let's go ahead and dive into the track. I think we'll start with the keyboards. There's a lot of really cool stuff happening in the keyboards on this track. Tony Banks, who is an amazing songwriter, an amazing keyboardist. I love his ear, not just for arrangement and for parts, but also for sounds. You know, he always has really cool, really unique sounds on every song that they do. I took a look, I did some research at, you know, maybe some of the keyboards he was using at this time, and it looks like he was using the Yamaha DX7, a Prophet 5, and a Fairlight and an EMU emulator and a few other things. You know, I'm sure he had a ton of keyboards, but on this track, you can really hear a lot of the DX7 and then also some of the Prophet. And then there's another keyboard that he definitely didn't use that I'll show you guys that I used that I think worked really well. But, you know, the thing about these kind of keyboard sounds is that a lot of them are like patch-based types of sounds. You know, these aren't like, you know, programmed sounds like where you go on a mini Moog and you dial in a sound with an oscillator and filters and all that stuff. A lot of this stuff is very much like he pulled up a preset and it was a really cool sound. He wrote a cool part. And those are kind of the hardest kind of sounds to recreate because if you don't have that specific keyboard with that specific patch, it can get really challenging to recreate. So that was the thing about this track that was really challenging. Probably the most challenging overall was the keyboards. And I'm fortunate that I have a Yamaha DX7 and a Prophet 5, which I think worked really well, which we'll look at in a second. But yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the keyboard rig, and I'll show you guys kind of what I've got going on. Okay, cool. So this is the keyboard rig. I used just these 3 keyboards for the whole record. And so we got a Prophet 5, and then a Yamaha DX7 right below that. And then this bottom one is a Roland D50, which is not like super popular, but this keyboard actually came out a couple years after this record was made, which is why I know he didn't use it on this particular record. But I would not be surprised to find out that Tony Banks started using this keyboard later on when it came out, because it has a lot of very like Genesis-y sounding presets on it, which ended up being really cool. So I got lucky trying this one out with how it worked. And we'll look at some of the parts later on. You get to hear, you know, just how like Genesis-y this keyboard sounds. But yeah, it's the Roland D50, and it's a sample-based synthesizer. So it's got a lot of those really cool kind of sample-based type of sounds on it. And so I just had a lot of fun just going through presets on this and kind of finding sounds that worked for the different parts. And so another kind of cool discovery that I made is these keyboards, the Prophet 5 and the DX7 are both mono. So they just have a mono output on the back. And when I was playing in the track, I was like, man, I really need to figure out a way to make these keyboards a little bit more like stereo sounding. So what I ended up trying out, which worked really well, was this H3000 on this preset called multi-flange. So the thing about the H3000 is that some of the presets are true stereo, which means that it takes a left and right input, and then it gives you a left and right output. And then some of the presets are mono to stereo, which means that they'll take the left input only, and they will convert it into a stereo sound, which is something that's important to know, you know, whenever you're using certain presets on here. But the multi-flange is one of those presets that will take a mono input and convert it into stereo, and it just has a really cool sound. So this is a really important part of all these keyboard sounds. Every keyboard sound we're going to hear here in a second was recorded through this on that preset. So real quick, I'll just kind of give you a sample of the difference. So that's with it on. So let me just bypass that. And then with it. And you can really hear it. It sounds so much more, you know, Genesis-y. Like whenever I found that preset, I was like, okay, that's it. That is like the Tony Banks keyboard sound, which I don't know what they use. I don't know if they use that or, you know, they probably use something, you know, to make these keyboards stereo sounding like that. But it also kind of just contributes, that flange kind of gives it that movement to the sound that's just, it's just way more interesting sounding than like this, which is, you know, it just kind of feels kind of static by comparison. Yeah, so every keyboard I recorded on this record, pretty much, except for the bass stuff, was going through that on that preset. That's pretty much the keyboard rig. So like I said, all three of these keyboards made up the whole track. So, okay, cool. So let's take a look at some of these parts. So we'll just start at the intro. Okay, so the first part I was hearing was this kind of like 16th note. It almost sounds like an arpeggiator, like up high though. You know, but if you listen to the track, you kind of can't tell if it's just like eighth notes, like someone playing eighth notes, or if it's like a 16th note arpeggiator type of thing. So what I ended up doing was actually just playing in an eighth note pattern, but using a dotted eighth note delay to sort of generate that 16th note pattern. This is very similar to like what we do on guitar all the time with like rhythmic delays, you know, like the Edge or something where you use the delay as part of your part to generate a different rhythm than what you're playing. And so I actually put the delay on and I was actually playing into the delay and responding to it in order to find like a rhythm and a part that felt cool, like in the track. So, like I'll show you right here. This is what I'm literally playing on the keyboard. But with the delay, it sounds like this. You know, so I'm using the delay to create that 16th note rhythm, and I've never even heard it without the delay because literally, like I said, I put the delay on, and then I was playing with the delay, which is a cool technique a lot of times, especially like on guitar when you're kind of looking for a part. It's a cool thing to experiment with because it will often kind of inspire a very different part than you might have played without the delay. So that's a cool way to use an effect to sort of inspire a different idea, but in this particular case, I was just kind of trying to generate similar kind of motion as I was hearing the original track. So if I went through these delays on all these different tracks, all these different layers of keyboards, you would see different dry wet settings and everything because I was literally just kind of adding in parts as I felt like I needed in order to generate a stereo width that felt like the original track. And then we've also got just like some pads. Oh, so here's a really cool like example of the D50, one of those patches. It sounds almost like the organ on Prince on Purple Rain, Prince's Purple Rain. I think that was called Cathedral Organ on the D50. Unfortunately, on these intro pads, I didn't label which keyboard was which, but this just would have been a hodgepodge of those three different keyboards, like I said. But this, I'm pretty sure this was the D50 though. Yeah, so we got some cool pads. Like I said, going through the H3000 on that Metaflange preset made a really big difference. And then there's not much going on in the verse. Halfway through, we have this kind of weird DX7 patch that comes in. Now did you... And so that's literally just a preset on the DX7, and it's internal 16. I didn't write down the name, unfortunately, but if you just go to internal 16 on the DX7, it's that particular preset, and that might have been the exact one they used on the record because it sounds real similar. But yeah, that's what's coming in halfway through the verse, and then we get into the pre-chorus. Oh yeah, see we got another D50 patch right here. I just love some of these patches on the D50. And that's cartridge 57 is that preset. And then that's just something I dialed up on the Prophet. And this is a DX7 pad. And that's like a DX7, like a piano patch, you know? And then going into the chorus, you know, we obviously have these pads that kind of carry over from the pre-chorus into the chorus, but then we have more of those kind of eighth note kind of things like we had in the intro. And then, yeah, that same DX7 patch we had halfway through the verse comes back in, doubling the bass part. So we'll get to the bass here in a second, but that's what this part's doing. It's doubling what's an octave higher, what's going on in the bass. It looks like a lot of tracks because it is, but there's basically 3 parts. So you got the part doubling the bass part, we got the 16th note stuff, and then we've got the pads. You know, the pads go a long way to sort of filling out the track in a really good way. But this is all stuff just, you know, I add a part, and then if I listen back, I'm like, man, it needs a little bit more of a mid-rangey kind of thing. You know, I'll go look for a patch that has that flavor, and I'll put that in. And it ends up just being, you know, quite a few tracks, but I'm always just listening inside of the track and thinking about what's missing. And then, you know, a lot of times the quicker way with a keyboard is just to add another layer that kind of has that sound. And then we go into the bridge, the instrumental, and it opens up just with a bunch more pads. And this is almost entirely the D50, like I was talking about. So I think I made this first one just with the Prophet. There's kind of a standard pad sound, but these other 4 of the 5 are just presets off the D50. So we've got internal 22, which is like a French horn. Flutish brass. Cartridge 67, cartridge 57, and that's all 4 of them together. Yeah, it just really has that kind of Tony Banks character to it. I love that Genesis, you know, keyboard style. It's just really cool. And then there's a solo, so. And so this is, I mean, this is one of those things where if I hadn't found that D50 and I hadn't found that those presets worked so well, I don't know how I would have done that because it's such a distinct sound. And this is not, this part probably of the entire song, this is probably the most different compared to the original record, just because, you know, I'm just having to find sounds that feel right for the track. I can't obsess too much over finding his exact sounds because they're just too specific. So it's very much the flavor of Genesis and Tony Banks, but I'm not being too obsessed about it being exactly the same because I think that would just be kind of ridiculous. But let's just listen to some of these. So we've got 4 patches that make up this lead part, and all 4 of them are the D50. So. And then the next one. And then we got this. I love this one. It's called Saxy Saxophone. I thought that was a great title. Oh, it looks like halfway through I added in the Prophet. And then this last chord is a stab with the Prophet, and then it has a little bit of this Waves Enigma on it, which is I can't figure out exactly what this is. I think it's a flanger. I always just use it on the default preset because it has that great motion to it, but that's pretty much it. So that's pretty much all the keyboards. Like I said, that D50 really ended up being a really important part of this whole thing. I don't know how I would have done it without that. So yeah, the DX7 and the Prophet are kind of obvious when you listen to the track. But all the other stuff, all the other kind of weird sampley sounds, I was really leaning hard on that D50. If I didn't have that, I would have had to try something. I don't know. But yeah, so that's all of our keyboards. We'll go to the bass because the bass kind of is a keyboard part as well. One of the parts of this track that's the most distinct that most people kind of probably latch onto when they first hear it is that very distinct kind of crazy bass sound that's playing in sync with the drums. In fact, let me play that with the drums. So this bass part, I must have redone, I mean, like 5 or 6 times from scratch because I just kept like messing it up. And I ended up always having like 5 or 6 layers. And then it just felt kind of loose and weird. I kept listening to the record and being like, man, it's just so tight though. And there has to be a way to pull this off with just like 1 or 2 sounds at the most. And so I was doing a lot of research about the keyboards and everything. And everyone was like, oh, it's a DX7 patch, E-Bass 1. Which is what this is, but you can tell on its own it's not. You know, so like I knew that wasn't the only part of this bass sound, so I was always kind of pulling in a bunch of different other sounds. At one point I even had like a piano, kind of like, because I had this kind of almost piano-y attack to it, it seemed like on the original record, but that wasn't working. And then finally I was like, you know what? It sounds almost like white noise. Like it sounds almost like the DX7 bass, but then like a white noise with an envelope filter on it. So that's actually what I ended up landing on. So we've got the regular just DX7 bass right here. And then we got this other track right here, which is literally just white noise. So I called up on the Prophet 5. I just pulled up the noise channel, turned down both the oscillators, and then recorded the part like that. So it's literally just the white noise from the Prophet. You could use any synthesizer, it really doesn't matter. And then I took the filter section and I sort of just played with the attack and release envelope and the resonance until I got kind of that weird resonant peak on the attack. And I accentuated that further with this Moog plugin in Pro Tools. This is actually just a stock plugin in Pro Tools. And so it's like an envelope filter, and I'll play it with and without that. So and here's what the mix. So that's just accentuating that kind of you know, envelope filter type of sound, but that blended with the regular DX7 bass sound ended up being pretty close. And then I ended up wanting to have a way to give it a little bit more low end if I wanted it, and I thought a good way to do that was probably going to be to double up the part with a lower kind of like sine wave bass, kind of like this. So that's just like a clean, sine wave bass sound that I knew that I could kind of blend into taste, just to give the whole sound a little bit more of like a clean, deep low end. So I'll play like just the DX7 bass with the noise, and then I'll put this in. So that's giving us a lot more of like a deep kind of sub sound. That's why I call it a sub. And then this just would have been like a parallel, like Pultec kind of thing, just to give it even just a little bit more low end. And so that's pretty much it. It's not 100% identical to the record, but I think it serves the purpose pretty well. I would have loved to get even just a little bit more of that white noise kind of thing, that aggressive character, because it's just so like aggressive on the original record, and it's so cool. But this is about as close as I could get it. Like I said, after 5 or 6 tries, I'll be like, you know what? I think this is gonna work. I gotta move on. So that's the bass that's going through the bulk of the track. I did notice that it sounded like there was like regular bass guitar in at least a couple sections. So I actually brought some during the chorus. I brought in just a regular bass guitar. And then the bridge. So the bridge sounds like just a regular bass guitar, which is what I recorded. That's pretty much it on the bass side of things. And then let's go ahead and take a look at the drums. So Phil Collins has got to be one of my all-time favorite drummers. I think there's so many things about his playing that are great. There's his feel, there's his parts, the way he plays the song, and then there's his sounds. One of the things I appreciate so much about Phil is how diverse he is in his catalog. Now, I know a lot of people, when they think of Phil Collins, they think of like the big concert toms with the big gated reverb kind of thing. And that certainly became a big part of his sound. But if you really listen to the Genesis catalog and you listen to, song to song, how diverse his sounds are, he really crafts a sound for the song, which is something I really appreciate. So he's not the kind of drummer that like has his sound and it just goes on everything. He really plays to the track. He goes everything from like super dry, kind of tight drums to the big roomy drum sound to the electronic drums to a mixture of both. Like he really was very experimental, which I appreciate. Of course, all the members of Genesis were that way, but I just appreciate the way that he could always craft a sound for the particular song. And this track is no exception. So I don't know exactly what they did on this original recording. I have my theories, which is that it probably started as a drum loop. I think the kind of giveaway is the fact that the kick drum pattern is exactly the same all the way through the track, even during the drum fills, which is not, it's just not how a person would play. Like, listen to the kick drum pattern. And then to me, right here, where he does the snare drum fill, the fact that the kick drum keeps going exactly the same makes me feel like it was probably a loop, like in a drum machine. I just don't feel like that's something a person would play. Maybe. I mean, it is Phil Collins. And, he's a lot better drummer than I am. So maybe that's what it is. But I have a feeling that this was a loop. And then later on, they overdubbed a live snare drum, because that's what it sounds like, especially in the drum fills. The drum fills very much sound like a real person playing a snare drum in a room. So that's my theory. Could be wrong. I don't know. I wasn't there, but that's pretty much what I did. I mean, I did record a live kick, but I basically played the pattern in, one bar, like one really good bar, and then looped that, because it's just such a challenging pattern to keep up all the way through the song. So that's pseudo programmed. It is a live kick drum that I recorded myself, but it is basically just kind of looped through the song. And then I went through afterwards and I layered in the snare drum fills and all that stuff, because those felt very much like a real live drummer. And then I recorded the hi-hat. So I did this kind of like I did the ELO record, you know, kind of one piece at a time, like that. But that's the main drum part. And then when it goes into the bridge, we have like totally electronic sounding drums. So we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, let's just go ahead and listen to these drums. So here's my kick drum. So very clicky. This at one point was actually like my parallel kick track that I compressed really heavily, and then I ended up muting the regular one later on because I needed that really clicky attack in the actual track. And I didn't need a ton of low end because the bass was really what's carrying the low end in the track. So that's my bass. That's my bass drum. And then the snare drum is, you hear some of the live snare drum, but it's actually mostly a sample at this point because I thought I had a really good drum sound, but after I got all the other instruments in, I was like, I don't know, I kind of missed some work, I think, on the snare drum. So I'll show you what my snare drum sounded like, which was this. So that was my snare drum. That's actually like a sub mix, and you can tell it's heavily compressed of like several different microphones and stuff like that. So we're hearing a little bit of that, but then we're hearing mostly this sample, which was actually from, if you have a Superior Drummer, there's a Hugh Padgham sample pack. It's called the Hitmaker, and Hugh Padgham, of course, is the guy who produced these records. Incredible producer, gets incredible drum sounds. And so I took this sample. It's the 5x14 Premier 2000. You know, so I triggered that for my regular snare drum, and together those sound kind of like this. And then I went through some EQ, went through some compression, and that's what we ended up with right here. And then I have a parallel track right here that's like heavily compressed. And together they sound like this. And then those are both feeding into this reverb, Valhalla Vintage Verb, which is set to the large gated snare preset. And you can hear how big a part of the sound this is. So let me just mute that. So that's obviously like a really big part of the sound is this gated reverb. Really gives it that huge kind of explosive character. And then also, this is another thing that makes me think this was probably a drum machine loop at some point, is this clap sample. So I found this clap sample that plays like every other bar just on the offbeats. It's like a really important part of that groove is that little bit of clap, and it's not even very loud. I remember like kind of like putting it up just as loud as to where you could almost not even really notice it, but it really enhances that groove. Like here's without it. It's just like really missing that backbeat that the clap gives us. That's just so much. It's amazing, just 2 clap hits per bar enhance that groove that much. So we got this kind of crazy kick drum that's like looped all the way through. We got the offbeat kind of disco hi-hat, and then we got that clap happening every other bar. That's really important. And that's going through the bulk of the track until we get to the bridge. So once it gets into the bridge, it sounds totally just like an electronic drum set to me. I'm sure it was probably the Simmons drums that he had. So what I did is I pulled, I just programmed this bridge part with the, again, the Superior Drummer Hugh Padgham patch. So if you go into the Hitmaker Machines library that they have for Superior Drummer, is Hugh Padgham sampled a bunch of the different electronic drums that they used, you know, through the 80s with Genesis and stuff. And it's just, again, I don't know how I would have done it without that, because it's the exact sound. So let's see, we got the hi-hat. Got the kick drum. And again, we got the gated reverb on the snare. That's really important. And so yeah, that's pretty much all the drum stuff. Like I said, really appreciate Phil for a lot of reasons, but again, the fact that we would even just go to a totally different drum sound for this bridge, you know, that's the kind of stuff that really makes this record special and feel like an adventure, even though it makes it kind of probably a nightmare when you go to play it live a little bit later on. But yeah, that's pretty much the drums. So like I said, pretty much a drum loop, probably with a live snare drum. At least that's pretty much how I did it. And then the bridge is just straight up Simmons electronic drums. And then we go right back into the acoustic drums after that to the end of the song. So, but yeah, really cool drum track. And then, so let's move on to some of the guitar stuff. There's a lot of really cool guitar parts in this track. They do kind of take a backseat to the synths, of course, but still some really important parts. Obviously, we have the main riff. So all these guitar tracks were done on a Galen Kruger ML250. I think that's the model number. You guys have seen me talk about it before on all the Def Leppard videos, but it's basically like very similar to like a Rockman X100. And that's what I was hearing on this record, was kind of like that very nasally, very mid-forward electric guitar sounds that really have no bottom end, and it just kind of sit right there in the spot where they need to. Yeah, when you listen to these guitar parts, you're like, wow, man, there's absolutely no low end, but you don't miss it in the track. We've got so much low end happening with the keyboards and with the bass. So yeah, very thin, but they work very well in the track. So then we go into the verse, and we have this guitar part right here. So that's the dry, and then I'm obviously going through a little bit of coarse with the H3000, a little bit of delay and reverb. And that chorus is really important. There's already some chorus on the Galen because it has a chorus button on it. But I went through a little bit of the H3000 also to give it just a little bit more stereo image, so it's not so mono. And also, I think that delay is really important. You know, it's kind of a almost like a 16th note pattern. And then moving into the pre-chorus, we have this cool kind of like backbeat chords. Gives you that really glassy kind of strat thing. And then what? I don't even remember what I played on the chorus. Oh yeah. You know, and not the kind of guitar sound that you would be too excited to show anybody, you know, on its own. But in the track, it works. And this is the kind of stuff that I never even listened to on its own. This is my first time probably hearing that in solo, because I just hear it in the track and I just manipulate it until it sits right in the mix. And a lot of times you'll go to play it in solo and go, oh God, what is that? But moving into the instrumental. Really cool part by Mark Rutherford on the guitar. Then the only other thing I think is that during the bridge, the guitar doubles the synth leads. that's pretty much it. Not a ton of stuff happening on the guitar. Pretty minimalistic, but really important. You know, these parts they're small, but they're really important. They really add a lot of texture to the track. And so the last thing I guess we should look at is the vocals, which are a really important part. I want to give a huge shout out to my buddy Brian Hicks for coming in and just doing a really killer job on this track. So I've worked with Brian a lot over the years. We played in different cover bands and things like that. Funny enough, we've never done a Genesis song, although I always kind of felt like, he had that kind of timbre to his voice that would work really well. So actually I called him over and asked him to try a few of them. We went through a few different Genesis tracks just to kind of see which one he felt the most comfortable on. And this is the one that we landed on. There was a couple of really important discoveries about the vocals on this track once I got into it. One of them was the microphone choice. So because of the fact that we had sang like 3 or 4 songs, and I wasn't really thinking about mic choice as much as I wish I would have, after I got into the mix, I was kind of like, ooh, I think I missed something here, because we tracked it on a Stam Audio U87, which is like a U87 clone, like a large diaphragm condenser type of microphone. But then I remembered thinking back on like videos I've watched of Genesis in the studio, and Phil Collins was always using a Beyerdynamic M88, and that's a dynamic microphone. It's like a handheld, dynamic mic. You'd think in a studio a lot of times we use higher quality microphones like large diaphragm condensers, but I remember specifically that he used that microphone, and later on in the mix I was like, you know what, I think I know why. Because with a voice like Phil or like Brian, where you have a lot of brightness, all that extra detail in the condenser almost kind of works against you, especially when you start going to apply effects. And this is a very heavily affected vocal, a lot of the Phil Collins stuff is. So I had a little bit of a challenging time really getting all these effects on Brian's vocals, and I feel like it's just because of the fact that there was so much detail in the high end with that condenser that had I just tracked him through a dynamic, like an SM7 or whatever I had, the lack of detail and the transients of the high frequencies kind of works in your favor once you start going to apply a bunch of effects. I've definitely used the SM7 a lot, like on rock tracks, things that I sing, and it takes to effects really well. So I think I kind of missed the mark on that part of the vocal recording, which is on me, but I also think it's a good learning moment about how we can use different types of microphones to our advantage, depending on, not just the voice, but also what we're going to be doing with it later. The fact that we're going to add tons of effects on this vocal means that, we probably want to use something that doesn't have all those details in the high end. Or at least in my experience, that seems to work better. So I think that's something I could have done a little bit better on the vocal recording side of things. That being said, I'm really happy with how it came out. And I think it got there eventually. This is just one of those things that I'm trying to take away from this experience of going, you know what? For Brian's type of voice, for a Phil Collins type of voice, that you want to heavily affect, we're probably better off trying dynamics. So anyway, I thought that was kind of a cool thing. But so what I know about Phil Collins and his vocal effects is that he was a really big fan of the AMS DMX-15, which is I think it had like 4 delays in it. It's a delay and pitch shifting unit. You can pitch shift the delays, and I think it has 4 delays in it, if I'm not mistaken. But really amazing sounding unit, and it's very particular part of his vocal sound. I think I even heard a story once of him like he would set it himself. He would sing and set it up, because he had a very particular way that he liked to set it, especially depending on the song. I've tried the plugin before, and I didn't care for it really. So this is definitely like one of my bucket list pieces of analog hardware, especially with my collection. Man, I really want to have a DMX-15 one of these days. But so I just had to kind of mess around with a bunch of different stuff until I found something that seemed to work. One thing about this track is that it's actually not quite as heavily affected as some of the other Genesis tracks I noticed once I really got into it. So we'll just look at some of the stuff I do. It's a lot of stuff you've seen me do on other rock tracks. A little bit of micro pitch shift, a little bit of delay, a little bit of reverb. So let's just go ahead and check out the vocals on their own.
I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams, been haunted by 1,000,000 screams. I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams. I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams.
So pretty heavily affected. I would say not as heavily affected as, like I said, some of the Genesis tracks or some of the Phil Collins solo records, especially. But we've got just basically a little bit of reverb, a little bit of H910, and then a little bit of H3000. Looks like it's on the multi-flange preset, which is kind of interesting. I must have had it on there from like doing the keyboards, and then I tried it on the vocals, and it was cool. But let me just put these effects in one at a time. We can hear what all these are adding. So
I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams.
So that's kind of like a bright, short delay. I mean, I'm sorry, reverb. I used the PCM60 for that.
I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams.
And then that's the Eventide H910. Looks like I pitched it up just 0.01, which is actually quite a bit. That unit like moves in increments of what sounds like 9 cents. I've never looked at it in the manual or anything, but
I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams.
And then just a little bit of short delay, left and right, and then the H3000.
I must have dreamed 1,000 dreams, been haunted by a million screams.
And it's getting us kind of in the ballpark of that Phil Collins sound. I think another Genesis track probably would have been better for me to really go after the Phil Collins sound. That's probably something I'll do eventually because it is a sound that I think is super cool. And I think Brian's voice is really good for that. So I don't know, I may do that someday, but in this particular track, once I really got into it, I'm like, you know what? This is not super like Phil Collins-y, heavily affected. It's affected and it's a rock vocal and stuff, but I didn't feel like this was the track to really go after that AMS sound. So this is where I left it, and it works pretty good in the track, I think. So pretty simple stuff on the vocals. And they've got a few backup parts, mainly in the chorus. And this is a submix of, this was just me and Brian, like just going back and forth, adding parts until we're like, oh yeah, that feels pretty close. Okay, cool. So I think that's just about everything to talk about on this track. Like I said, huge fan of Genesis. Wouldn't be surprised if I ended up doing another one at some point, but appreciate you guys sticking around to the very end. If you want to drop a comment down below of a song you'd like to hear, I'd love to hear it. And like I said, if you guys want to support the channel, if you want to check out that course, that'll be in the description down below. But I appreciate you guys sticking around, and I will see you guys next time.